Hello, everybody. Today is May 11th, 2021. It's 11:33 a.m. and this is the Language Workstream meeting for the Inclusive Learning Initiative. My name is Celeste. I will be your host for today. And it's going to be, I have a feeling it's going to be a pretty light meeting just because KubeCon was last week, and I personally have not touched this since prior to KubeCon, so forewarning. So first things first, do we have any new people on the call who would like to introduce themselves? Okay, sounds good. So for those of you who weren't able to attend a couple of weeks ago, we had a working session on our language recommendations. It was really, really good and really, really useful. And I'm just going to share my screen shortly and go through like what was done and what our next steps are going to be around this. So what we took a look at as a group was we went through the spreadsheet and we looked for duplicate terms. Then we looked at whether or not a consensus had emerged amongst the replacements. And then we recorded the terms that had duplicates and if a consensus was available. And this is going to form the body of the first set of recommendations that we make, which are consensus driven. So there's a couple of follow-on tasks. One, and I am wondering if Julian is on the call. Julian is on the call.
Hello, I am on the call. Hi, Celeste.
Hi, I'm sorry to call you out. I don't mean to be intimidating at all. But one of our follow-on tasks is language recommendations and the recommendation template into this, which I think you said you were going to do, correct?
I am, and yes, I see you've added some
a table
cells. I did look at earlier today, and that wasn't there, so that's now me there, which is great. So yes, I will be happy to start putting some actual content into there now.
Okay, Julian, I did this an hour ago, so I apologize that it wasn't there prior. Okay.
Julian, I'm happy to help out if you want some help doing that. I don't know if it's a multiple person task, but if you feel like you want some help, I'm available.
Thank you, Carla. I do have some initial ideas, but perhaps if I do a first draft and then I'm happy for you to have a look at it and suggest or add anything to it, if that works for you.
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. Thank you so much for your help. So that's kind of the long and short of that. Once we have the recommendation template, my follow-up is to create GitHub to-dos for all of these terms and ideally capture term pairs as a part of that to essentially produce the recommendation based on the template that we have and based off of the third task that requires a bit more work. And let me go digging in my tabs for a second. Apologies. Come on. Naturally, I cannot find it when I need it. Let me go digging through my Google Docs. The third follow-on task is mine and Joanna's. And that is working and finalizing our sort of version 2 of our language evaluation framework and our principles for evaluating language. Joanna and I are still working on this just because we've both been a little bit busy. But the takeaway from the last meeting is that we were going to try and combine the principles that Joanna had defined in her document and the existing framework, because we didn't really, there was too much overlap between the two documents to try and make them separate, I think. So Joanna and I had a quick conversation around that. Carson, I will get to you shortly. This is roughly where we're landing, which is we're keeping this framework of the first, second, and third order concerns, but we're aligning those concerns with the principles that Joanna had defined in her document. As you can see, this is still incomplete. So that's my blocking item for future work. The type column, language use for various. Mark, just to get to your comment in the chat, the type column was filled in by kind of the rest of the group, so I'm not super concerned that that data is not 100% normalized yet. It was just kind of freeform. Okay.
Do you want contributions to that document that you just showed us?
You know what? Yeah.
If you're not ready, that's fine. But I saw you have the questions open, and I thought that's something we've thought about with our group at where I work. So I can offer you stuff that you can use or not.
I think that would be really, really helpful,
Okay.
Carla. And I'm just going to grab the link for you.
Okay.
And drop it in the agenda.
Thank you.
Work. So it's just right here, okay? And Carson, you have been very patiently waiting with your hand raised. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. Well, I need to take you back 2 steps, so I might as well wait till it's time to. I want to go back to the recommendations list, which is maybe this also partly touches upon what Mark was saying. I might be incorrect about this, but I had a feeling, and so I sat with it for a minute. And my feeling was I didn't notice that I didn't catch this work was happening until after it had happened, like 2 hours later or something. So I'm wondering if there's other. So I'm looking at the work and I'm like, it's I just to be able to achieve consensus and stuff. I'm wondering if there's other people who may want to within the language workstream before we present it any higher might want to do. I don't know exactly what other there is to do, but because you already had the first set of conversations and went through it. So so I don't know what would do that would, but
okay.
Yeah, just kind of like how do we to achieving consensus, particularly when this thing it ultimately is going to require all of us. So that's what it means, right? So one way or another, before we go on from here, I think we need something that is a confirming step, which may generate another working session if that's required or something, but just so we can, and which may end up, maybe this is just a thread in chat or something, but just something that gives us a chance to be able to teach, oh, why did you choose that? Or what about this thing? Or just all those things that happened in real time in that session that might be there. So
here's what I'm envisioning as the next step, which I think is going to be the confirmation step that you're thinking of. And I'm with you. I'm with you because, and like, this is kind of the hard thing about working with effectively people who are volunteers is we're never going to get everybody in the room consistently every single time because we all have full-time jobs, which aren't this. What I'm hoping the next step is going to be is once that language template is in place, and once we sort of have our principles document revised in a way that we're happy with. First off, both of those will have a final review phase before we're done. Second off, I think the act of producing individual recommendations, like what I'm envisioning is that we're going to parcel out all of these individual terms, and there's going to be one owner for term who drafts up a recommendation based on A, the data, B, providing a bit of research, and C, the template that we set out. And then those go out to review for the rest of the group. And we make sure that like we are in line before we actually publish anything. So it's effectively like a draft review stage. This list was really just a result of like combing through what we kind of got back from everybody.
Right. And was there anything that was dropped? Was there anything that was dropped on the cutting room floor as part of that process that didn't make the cut?
So there was actually one thing that this might actually be a good topic for this group to talk about as well. We flagged quite a few, I want to say 3 or 4 of this list of 20, so like a decent chunk, which were, we had a question of scope on the table. And the question was, where does this idea, sorry, back up, Celeste. I think we initially defined our scope as trying to address harmful language and terminology within technology and within tech, within software, and that is our domain space. But you run into terms like, we have this idea of like oversee or salesman, which were provided to us as recommendations that have been made that we should consider. But we flagged them as potentially being just more generally business rather than tech specific. And so we had a question of, as a group, as to whether we should make recommendations based on these. Is that out of scope? It's not on the cutting room floor. It's just like.
Well, and sort of similarly, like, and I don't know, I mean, you saw my early on, I never actually got through to the point where I could get anybody to agree to the, do much. We have an internal list of things that I'm working with in Red Hat that are things outside of this. Like, I'll give an example of a phrase that that personally is like mine to champion is drink the Kool-Aid. It's a highly problematic phrase. A lot of people don't know why. It gets used all over the place, So that's something that's not really, that doesn't fit in an I&I thing because it's not going to appear in a line of code or in a documentation necessarily. So it's like that's kind of the, there's a whole list of things in my mind that would fall out of scope because of that. So one thought was curious, I think, for seeing what doesn't, if there was anything that people suggested that didn't make the list or why. That's interesting.
That sounds like something that's been rolling around in my mind and that I asked about the other day. What is our scope? So right now, I think we're looking at things in technical language, but there's also a real need to look at business language, stuff that you hear in meetings. And this has come up in the work I've done within the company that I'm in, where people submit things and say, somebody said this in a meeting and it was so upsetting. And you think, it breaks my heart. I'm going to put it in this file for later. But right now we're dealing with stuff that's in our content. But I think that this is the kind of thing you get to in like the second iteration where we say, let's stop saying this in meetings.
Does our framework and our first, second, third orders give us any clarity on that?
Let me pull up the framework. So again, still very much a work in progress. And this is actually something that Joanna and I need to revisit, but Joanna is actually quite busy with work these days. And bless her, she's done an absolute mountain of work. So please go forth and do your day job. So Joanna's, the principles that Joanna came up with in her earlier document, and just to sort of refresh everybody's memory, this is the document that Joanna was working on and the many, many comments you all very helpfully left. Joanna's principles map really well to what the original framework sort of had as first and second order concerns. What the original framework sort of stated was effectively first order concerns are things that are tied to somebody's identity. And second order concerns are terms that are a little bit violent, a little bit problematic, but they aren't necessarily directed at a specific person or group of people. This is to get to your question around, does the framework offer any clarity around business language? The original framework's sort of third order concerns were around clarity, anthropomorphism, and just general idioms. So those were concerns a little bit more around language. But it doesn't really, I think you could foreseeably run a phrase like drink the Kool-Aid through this framework and like eventually it would kind of hit on one of the concerns, but our principles don't currently cover anything that isn't
Sure, it
specifically
doesn't say
harmful.
the scope. It doesn't say the
Yeah,
scope. And
yeah.
we could decide we're going to put all marketing language through here as well if we chose to, but our particular areas of expertise and maybe our initial concerns are,
Yeah.
you know, IT technology, especially like for those people who are technical writers, what might get into the code in the UI that we have to document.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that comes up for me just as a question is, I know that the decision might have been made to just focus on the scope right now, but are we like earmarking these problematic terms in business language to say revisit yet, so that we don't have to completely go back and compile those at a later date when this, you know, when the time does present itself for that scope to expand?
That's a great question.
So one of the questions that I have is, you know, we might decide that we like these terms and such, but are there representatives of people using business language, and what, you know, are we representing people who use the language and care about that form, you know, that aspect?
That's a great call out. I think within Google, we have a similar product inclusion initiative where this a similar topic came up, and it's basically, you know, drawing from the mantra of nothing for us without us, right? And you have to invite members of that particular community or professionals, be they, you know, in linguistics or sociology, that would have a deeper understanding of why it's problematic, to come in an open forum, do that talk, and then the group makes the decision. But it has to, you know, again, incorporate the feedback from the appropriate parties before that's made, you know, before that's decided. I don't know how you guys are doing it, but that's just one suggestion.
I mean, this is where I think, at least for me, this is where the sort of difficulty of doing this effectively as an open source project presents itself, which is open source is kind of a push rather than a pull. And we can accept the contributions that we get, and we can accept the participants that we get. But that is something that's broadly speaking on my mind, which is how do we ensure adequate representation from underrepresented groups in this project going forward? The way that, at least from my perspective, one of the ways that we have to solve this is as we sort of become a legal entity and as we formalize a little bit, there's talk of like a governing board, which is typical for this kind of project. And I would personally like to ensure that any governing board that exists has representatives and has representatives in a certain percentage from certain groups. But the other thing that we've mentioned is that Carla's group in IBM they effectively have a similar board of effectively asking people whether asking people who are representatives of underrepresented groups. That is a resource we can potentially draw on, but it's not something we've talked about yet. Okay, I want to get to the folks who have their hands up, but is there any more discussion on this topic right now?
I find I have a lot to say, and maybe it's a topic that we want to devote some time to another time.
Yeah,
How's it all going to work mechanically and yeah.
Okay. With everybody's permission, what I would actually like to do is, rather than do our usual status update at the next occurrence of this meeting, let's close that meeting for discussion and let's talk about the mechanics of how this is going to work. Just because I agree, I think we need to give this a bit more time. Is that okay with everybody?
sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds
Yep.
good. And I'm happy to I'm happy to move at the pace that we all want to move. Okay, Kartik, I actually believe you had your hand up first.
Yeah, thanks, Celeste. So on the scope, on the discussion of the scope of INI, so for me, like a developer and an open source community contributor, may it be like a conference or a meetups or like a technical document or case studies. For anything on that aspect, I would like to refer INI recommendations. So in that sense, like if I'm going to talk on a conference, if I'm going to speak at a conference, salesman or salesperson is something like it is not a business term there. So I'm gonna like explain something there where like there is too much of open source enthusiasts and technology, like technology developers, technology product owners, and people like that. So in that sense, in that arena, for me, like salesperson is also something like we should be considering. Maybe what we can say is like, if as a group, like we feel like salesman is like not something as a technology content, but we can loosely say this is something we are recommending for people who are talking in conferences. Instead of saying like salesman, like you can say salesperson, something like that. So that's how I see as INI, and that's how I feel like every single open source contributor or every single developer, as a matter of fact, like a technical document, technical content creator, or people who write case studies in CNCF, anything, they should be referring INI recommendations, and INI should have recommendations for even those terminologies.
That's a good perspective. I didn't think about the conference talking angle, but that is definitely, it's a concern of my employer who, you know, hosts a significant amount of conferences. Monica, hi.
Just a suggestion here from a practical point of view, it could be that at least for the time being, we could give business related terms to the company work stream to at least kind of draft recommendations that they could then feed back to the language work stream, just to, you know, make things more, again, they would just be draft, but still that's a way for the groups to kind of work together. Just a suggestion.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say, I believe that if we have to validate terms with a particular group, like a demographic group or something like that, I actually believe that Microsoft has access to those groups, so that when we make a decision on, for example, I don't know, like First Nation or Indigenous groups, we consult with those groups first before we make a final decision. And so I'd have to consult my diversity and inclusion group, but I'm thinking that maybe we could make use of that, you know, that capability within Microsoft if we needed to vet certain terms. Just
yeah, that
for
would be
future
very, very useful. And I imagine that for you to be able to do that effectively, we need to firm up governance a bit more so you can talk to it.
Yes,
more.
Yes, but
okay.
But I'm always trying to think of, you know, Microsoft has a lot of resources, and what more could we be doing here? So that's
that's super helpful. And I imagine, again, I think Carla has something similar happening in IBM, and like this would actually be this would be an interesting thing to do, as opposed to like having groups in each individual company. Like, what if we just have a centralized resource or a way for those groups to collaborate across companies, which is a part of what we're trying to do here. Mark, you've added so many helpful things in the notes. Thank you, first off, for capturing those in the notes. It's really helpful. And second off, you've had your hand up very patiently. Mark, do you have anything you'd like to say? Going once, going twice. Okay, so I'm actually going to set up next week's or next occurrences schedule now. And we're going to be on the 21st, aren't we? Nope, the 25th, apparently. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I was having a little trouble with my audio.
No, it's okay. Feel free to talk, but I am going to set up that close to new items. And before I let you talk, let me just capture from Carla. What we want to talk about is specifically what is our scope, How do we consult on URMs in, how do we bring in the appropriate people to validate our recommendation?
And by scope, I'm interested in both where and what. Like what terms, closing in on what terms we're looking at and where they're occurring.
Or are we talking about scope in the sense of a specific set of terms, or scope in the sense of a little bit broader sort of principles?
Yeah, exactly. Both.
Okay. Okay. So if we're going to dedicate the next meeting to that discussion, is there anything else we want to cover in that time? So frankly, I think I have a feeling the discussion on scope will easily move through half an hour. So we might want to cap it there.
It might help prior to that discussion for each of us to put maybe a paragraph of verbiage together between now and then on what we think, what principle we think defines what the scopes ought to be, or something like that. That way, when we come to the table, we have a rough idea of what we're all thinking.
I think that's good. That is an action item for everybody on this call. I will post it in Slack as well after this call. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, by the way, Mark?
No, you captured it in the second bullet you wrote down there, Celeste, for the topics of next meeting.
Okay. We are at time, everybody. Per Mark's suggestion, I am going to say that let's spend next week talking about scope and making sure we're on the same page. And as an action item, please have a think around what our scope should be in your own words. And I think we have to walk away from this with the goal to try and define our scope. Okay. In the meantime, I have no, please. I tend to move really, really fast because I'm like a very action-oriented person, and I have ADHD, so I'm constantly doing 17 things at once. So I really, really appreciate that you took the time to slow me down. Thank you very much for being that moderating force.
Should we capture our ideas for that paragraph here in this document, say below these meeting notes?
What I would actually say is put yourself on the agenda for the next meeting. Okay. So it's closed to new items unless you have something to say on scope. Actually, I'm gonna, just to give people a hint.
That'll work.
So yeah, so we can go ahead and drop our thought in there.
Yeah. And what I'm actually going to say is let's maybe try and do this with a read-only meeting first. So please drop your thoughts on scope in this agenda in this section. And your task for the next meeting is to please read everybody's thoughts before the meeting. The expectation will be that you have come and read everything in this section prior to the next meeting. So that we
and I guess if we feel that someone's puts in just what we want, maybe instead of adding something, we just put our initials in +1 or something like that.
I think that totally works. Just +1 it in whatever way makes sense to you. Okay, I'm gonna post this in Slack so that the folks who couldn't join us today have the same reminder. Thank you all for this really, really fruitful discussion. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks so
Bye,
much,
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.